Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and today I'm very happy to welcome back to this radio program Lillian Faderman. Lillian Faderman is a renowned scholar of and considered founder of lesbian history and literature. Her many books include Harvey Milk, His Lives and Deaths, and The Gay Revolution. Her latest book, which she joins us to talk about, is called Woman, The American History of an Idea. She joins me over Zoom. Lillian Faderman, it is a great pleasure to welcome you back to this radio program.
Good to see you again, Mitch. Thank you for inviting me.
It's good to see you again. And of course, as we're talking about here, something that has been in the news now, and an issue that seems to sort of get around the idea of at least women today. And we're going to go back to the 17th century and work our way through chronologically. But of course, right now, everyone is paying so much attention to this report that the Supreme Court has confirmed that there is a draft majority opinion looking like the court is poised, so that can change, to overturn Roe v. Wade. Obviously, a third rail issue in American life seems to be a part of when we talk about ideas of women and women's rights. How do you see abortion when you think of woman as an American idea, the title of your book?
I'm still hoping against hope that this draft will not be what the Supreme Court finally concludes. The struggle for abortion has been going on for many decades before Roe v. Wade. Finally, with Roe v. Wade, women got the right that they had fought for so long. And it's concerning that the conservative majority in the Supreme Court are contemplating getting rid of that right. I understand that states will still have the right to make their own laws about abortion. It's just that Roe v. Wade, which gives women the constitutional right to an abortion, will be erased if this decision really does go through, as many of us fear it will. So presently, there are 26 states that have on the books these laws that will be triggered once the Roe v. Wade is repealed. There are 24 states in which women would still be able to get an abortion, but women in those 26 states will be out of luck unless they could travel to one of those 24 states. I fear it will make a huge difference for many women who are not capable for financial reasons or whatever of leaving their state. Fortunately, there's no talk about getting rid of contraceptives, but as we know, for many women, contraceptives are, for one reason or another, not effective or not possible to use. So I'm not going to say that it's going to put women back to the pre-1973 era, but I think for many women, this will make a huge difference.
Again, the title of your book is Woman, the American History of an Idea, and part of your thesis here and your argument is that woman is the idea of a woman as a social construction, a construction that's not always and frequently not created by women themselves. Do you see the issue of abortion in that way as part of the construction in this? I don't mean the act of abortion. I mean the battle over abortion and constructing the idea of a woman in the 20th century.
I think that from the beginning, a definition of woman, as one of the Puritans wrote, was that she is, quote, helpful in the propagating of mankind. She wasn't even given the large share of credit for having children, but she was simply helpful in the propagating of mankind. It was so tied to the definition of woman, and that women began to challenge it by saying they had a right to not bear children, they had a right to terminate pregnancies. It was an earthquake for people way past the 17th century who still honored that definition of woman, that her primary role was to be helpful in the propagating of mankind.
So this is a link you can find all the way back to the 17th
Absolutely
century.
a link. The notion that a woman should say, I don't want a child, I'm not ready for a child, I can't afford to have another child, I want to make a decision about when I bear children. That was traumatic for traditionalists who believed that a definition of woman, that her primary role was to bear children for men.
Your book begins in the 17th century, so we're talking the 1600s. You refer to this as an American history of the idea. Of course, this is before we have the Americas, I suppose, at this time. Is there something significant about the 17th century that you begin there?
Yes, it's when the colonists came to these shores. They met with a culture very different from theirs. The Native Americans viewed women, and I think this was true of most of the tribes, viewed women very differently. Women were, in some tribes, given a voice on the tribal councils. Women had the right in some tribes over their own body. They could say with whom they would have sexual relations. In some tribes, women made the proposal to the man they desired, and they decided when they wanted to get rid of that man. If they wanted to do that, they simply put his belongings outside of the longhouse, and that was considered a divorce. The Puritans in particular had a very hard time with that notion. I tell a story in my book about Roger Williams, who had been a high official in the Massachusetts Bay Colony before he broke with them and went to Rhode Island. And he wrote the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, about an incident in Connecticut. And that was that there had been a terrible massacre of a Pequot village in Connecticut. Many men, women, and children were killed. And the Pequots wanted to beg for peace, to sue for peace. And they did what they usually did. They sent a woman leader to the colonists to ask if there could be a truce and a peace agreement. Roger Williams wrote to John Winthrop, "We questioned her much for her truth and sent her away." They simply couldn't believe that a woman would have that kind of authority. And so the Pequots then sent another woman, and the same thing happened. They questioned her much for her truth and sent her away. And then the Pequots sent 5 women and an old man. And this time the colonists were willing to talk, but to the old man. They simply ignored the 5 women who were there. So it was just such a different relationship that the colonists had to the notion of woman from what so many of the Native American tribes had.
You also write about, in the early years of the American Republic, when George Washington still president, with a program that was called the Civilization Program, and trying to offer tribes to, become agrarians and farmers. And the Cherokee, it was always sort of split. It's kind of a complicated story, but a significant number of Cherokee tried to do this, and the federal government required that women play a specific role. I think even George Washington was instrumental in that.
Yes, George Washington, and then later with Thomas Jefferson. But the story is that the George Washington called together the men of the Cherokee Tribal Council and told them that their women must learn to spin and weave, just as the white women did. The reason for that, of course, was that the Cherokee men, as was true with many of the Indian tribes, their job was to hunt and to trap and to roam the lands that obviously the new nation of founding fathers thought should be reserved for settlement for white people. And so George Washington told the leaders of the Cherokee, the male leaders, that he would provide women who would teach Cherokee women how to spin and weave. And even decades later, that notion continued into during Jefferson's time as well. There was a movement to get Indian women to be domesticated, to do jobs around the house just as white women did, so that Indian men could take over the agrarian tasks that Indian women had done before. And in the 1820s, the man who was the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as it was then, talked about how the problem with Indians is that the women weren't sufficiently domesticated, and that would make a difference with Indian men. They would learn to cherish the home and, of course, emulate the situation among the white people.
So this early idea of woman comes from European colonizers to this land. Have you ever, and is it possible to trace where the idea begins and where it comes from in Europe?
Well, I think it was true all over Europe that woman was the second sex and inferior to man. But I think that once the Europeans came to this continent and thought they were settling the New World, and particularly in the New England continents, facing what they saw as a howling wilderness, and what they saw as these strange people, that is, these Native Americans who were already here, they became even more set on asserting masculinity, asserting muscle values, and even more set on making sure that women remained woman, that woman remained chaste and modest and obedience, and gave, as one of the colonists said, subjection to her husband, and that she not be, as another colonist said, a rash rambler abroad. And women who defied that were punished in various ways. Most famously, of course, Anne Hutchinson, who was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony because she dared to preach. But women who were disobedient to their husbands were put in the stocks, they were imprisoned, they were whipped, and this was true not only in the Puritan colonies, but in other colonies as well. They were punished by a cleft stick being fastened to their tongue because they had dared to talk back to men or to question in church the primacy of the ministers, or to question the magistrates. Later on in the 1650s and 1660s, they were hanged for not being proper women. And of course, in the 1690s, most famously, the Salem witch trials that victimized primarily women who dared to step out of the role that was appropriate to woman. They were shrews. They talked back to their husbands. They tried to do business in the world, and that was enough to very often get them to be accused of being witches, and in some cases to be hanged, in other cases to be imprisoned.
I want to know more about your analysis of the witch trial. Then it sounds like it's not necessarily about witchcraft.
I don't think it was necessarily about witchcraft. It was certainly hysteria. But what I discovered is that it was often hysteria that was triggered by women taking roles that wasn't deemed appropriate, roles that weren't deemed appropriate to them. I'm thinking, for instance, of the trial of Ann Hibbins, when she was first accused and brought to court and excommunicated. her husband was still alive, and he could protect her a little bit, but she was accused of being a shrew. She was very upset because she dealt with some carpenters that she thought cheated her, and she insulted them. She fought back. She said that this is robbery, and she was a rash rambler abroad, and that she even went to a neighboring town where the carpenters had worked, and she said that they cheat you too. All of this was inappropriate for a woman. When her husband died, he was no longer there to protect her, and she was accused of then not only being a shrew, but also of casting spells on people. And ultimately, she was one of the first women to be hanged. Other women who were accused of witchcraft had businesses. They were merchants. There was one who made butter and sold it to sailors, men who were going out on ships. She was accused of casting a spell on them through her butter. It was unusual for a woman to be a merchant, for a woman to do business. And so she too was accused of being a witch because she had overstepped the boundaries of woman. I found one case in particular very interesting of a woman who was accused of witchcraft. Her husband came to her defense and said, "She has borne me 12 children, and she has been a fine wife and mother, and I beg you to release her." And she was released because her husband said that she did what a woman was supposed to be. She was a fine wife and a mother of 12 children, the bearer of 12 children. So I think, yes, the accusations of witchcraft were often very much related to the idea of woman stepping out of the role that was deemed appropriate for her as woman.
So this is in part a history of, quote unquote, knowing your place. I was going to say imposed by men, but also, and you write about this, imposed by women too.
Yes, but I just want to say a few more words about it. Was a history of knowing your place. So in the 17th century, women were accused of being sinful by stepping out of their role as woman. In the 18th century, they were accused of being unnatural by stepping out of their role as woman. In the 19th century, they were accused of being manly or strong-minded or Amazonian. Amazonian was an accusation in the 18th century too, and it was not a compliment. And in the 20th century, they were accused of being lesbians or dykes when they stepped out of their role as women. But it seems that the accusation that tried to put woman in her place always had to do with her taking a role that challenged what was so-called womanly, what was traditional.
The word. We'll come back to my previous question. But actually, you've made me think of a different question. The word dyke, was that a pejorative?
It was certainly a pejorative. There's been a lot of discussion among linguists where it came from, and perhaps initially it might not have been a pejorative term. There was a phrase, all dyked out, which meant very fancy men's clothes. So maybe it came from there initially in the early 20th century. But then it came to mean someone who was sexually inappropriate as well as inappropriate in terms of gender. In the 1970s, radical lesbian feminists took that term and reversed the pejorative aspect of it. It became what radical lesbian feminists saw of as a positive term, a strong term. And I think that radical lesbian feminists learned that from African Americans. Black used to be a pejorative term, and African Americans claimed that term as positive and strong in the 1960s. And I think that lesbians learned that about the term dyke, just as LGBTQ people learned that about the term queer in the 1990s. It was a term meant to insult LGBTQ people. LGBTQ, of course, was not a term in the 1990s. And people who would now identify in that category began to call themselves queer as a matter of reclaiming that term.
And again, getting to this idea of know your place, and you talked about the evolution of that earlier, and I originally was going to say, well, it's something that's been imposed by men, but you write about this, it's also been historically imposed by women too.
Yes, I think that women have often been complicit in the idea of woman as it was first defined in the 17th century and continued to be defined in the 18th and 19th and even in the 20th century. And sometimes, again, as we will hopefully talk about later on, was so interesting to me to discover that there was a huge anti-suffrage movement, anti-woman suffrage movement beginning in the 19th century, and women were very active in that anti-woman suffrage movement. They made statements such as, we don't want to trouble ourselves with politics. We don't want to have to study political questions. We leave that to our husbands and our brothers and our fathers. And when they vote, they keep us in mind. They vote for us too. Women don't need the vote. Keep women in the protected home, they said. And of course, the same thing was true even into the 20th century, in the 1970s with the Equal Rights Amendment and Phyllis Schlafly and the Eagle Forum. They made the same kind of argument. Women don't want equal rights. We already have special privileges. We have our protected homes, and we want to stay in the protected home. We don't want to compete with men in the world. So yes, I think it's true that women have often been complicit in maintaining this notion of woman as it was first defined for white women in the 17th century.
Were the anti-suffragettes, were they powerful? Were they a powerful force against the suffragettes?
You know, there were chapters of various anti-women's suffrage movements all over the United States, and they didn't give up. Even as late as 1919 and 1920, when the amendment was ratified, they were still talking about how this is terrible for women. Women should not have to worry about the vote. They shouldn't have to worry about political decisions. They should have to worry only about their home and their children and their husbands. And so, yes, the anti-suffrage movement, women's suffrage movement continued even when it was clear that women were going to get the vote.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Lillian Faderman. Lillian Faderman's Professor Emerita at California State University, Fresno, and she is the author of many books. Her latest that we are in conversation about is called Woman, the American History of an Idea. Lillian Faderman, as we've talked about how this is in part a history of men and women trying to put women in, quote unquote, in their place, it's also obviously a history of women who refuse to be put in their place. And as you were talking about the anti-suffragettes there, it reminded me, as you also write about, when there is progress in this history that you tell for women, but it's not a linear progress. You can go forward and you can go backwards, just as you were talking about how the anti-suffragettes, even after the equal voting right, the voting rights, the women's suffrage voting rights was enshrined in the Constitution. They kept fighting afterwards. And it's kind of what we're seeing even today with Roe v. Wade. We opened up our phone lines on one of our recent shows after the news came out about the Supreme Court draft of overturning Roe v. Wade. And a young woman called in and she said, I always thought this would be something that would be legal. This was something that we wouldn't really have to worry about, that this is so sacrosanct. And I felt that way too. Like, oh no, overturning Roe v. Wade wouldn't be one of those things that could happen. But again, as part of this sort of history that you tell, progress is not always linear. It goes forward, but it also goes back after it goes forward.
Yes, and I think that that's been true throughout our history as the United States. But I'm particularly interested in tracing how it happened in the 20th century, just consistently throughout the 20th century. So in the 1920s, many women were in the workforce. About a third of college students were women. And then the Depression happened, and women were urged again back into the home. And they were told that women's place was in the home, and true women should not want to take jobs away from men who had families to support. And in 1941, the war happened. And again, it was a seesaw. Women were told that, of course, they had to get out there into the workforce. Of course, they had to help in the war effort by working in factories. And of course, they were welcomed into various military branches to free up men to fight in combat. There was the famous Rosie the Riveter image, obviously. And the war was over. And again, the seesaw, women were urged back into the home. And that was the era of what Betty Friedan has famously called the feminine mystique, where women were told that true women did not want to be in the workforce, did not want to be independent. All they wanted was to be wives and mothers. And then the feminist movement happened, and women fought hard to get women into the workforce and to increase women's independence in various ways. But in the 1980s, there was, again, a retreat to the home. And I think it was because of what Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist, has called the second shift. That is, men saw it as women's jobs, their wives' jobs, to certainly it was okay if they went out and made money, but they also had to come home, do the housework, take responsibility for the children. They were doing the second shift. And as Arlie Hochschild observed, men's contribution to the house was to walk the dog and fix the car. And that we got over that. Again, women went back into the workforce, but I think they were very troubled by the fact that it was so difficult to arrange for childcare. And even at the beginning of this millennium, there was again a movement called the opt-out revolution to send women back to the home, and many women were complicit. There was, for instance, a fascinating article in the New York Times in which the journalist interviewed several women who were members of a women's book group, all of them ex-lawyers, all of them with fancy degrees from Harvard and Yale and Princeton, who had opted out. They returned to the home. They spoke in terms that would have been very familiar to the Puritans about who woman was. They talked about how it's natural for women to want to be wives and mothers and to cherish the home, and why should they worry about high-powered jobs? They had come to a place where they could admit that woman was different from men, and they were very happy to give up their fancy credentials in making partner in law firms and go back to women's traditional role. And then the man session happened in 2008, and their husbands were losing jobs. In the 2008 man session, it was predominantly men who lost their jobs, jobs in construction, jobs in investment, jobs that were dominated by men. Women had to go back into the workforce, and they did, many of them gladly. By 2019, women's participation in the workforce was just about equal to men's participation in the workforce. Salaries were rising for women in all socioeconomic levels. Women with college degrees were making something like 92% of what men made. That was incredible considering where we had come from. And then COVID happened. Yeah. And again, women not only lost their jobs disproportionately, particularly working class women who were in jobs like hospitality, but also middle class women lost their jobs disproportionately. Or if they could work from home, if they could telecommute, they were still in trouble because they had disproportionate responsibility for the children because they couldn't rely on daycare. Daycare centers were closed, of course, for a period of time because of COVID. So it's been a seesaw. It looks now as though women have gone back to the progress they were making on all socioeconomic levels. But of course, that can't be relied on. Something may happen yet again to send women back to where they were in earlier decades. And what may happen to Roe v. Wade. And right now it looks as though that's a pretty sure bet. It will be repealed by the Supreme Court. That's an indication that, yes, we're still on a seesaw.
Do these backlashes, I don't know if that's the appropriate term or not, but when you're talking about the 80s, that's what I was thinking. It's like, oh, yeah, it's another backlash in the 80s, and to the progress that's always been made. And I think we see that in a lot of social movements. When there's progress made, there inevitably comes a backlash afterwards. But does that backlash also cause another backlash against it? Because I do suspect that if the Supreme Court is to move forward, and maybe there's other examples, different examples in history here, if the Supreme Court does go forward to overturn Roe v. Wade, that would actually be a galvanizing force as well in the women's movement.
I think you're absolutely right. It seems that it's been consistently, certainly throughout the 20th century and even into our century, it's been consistently 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but that 2 steps forward, they've put us ahead. And I think there certainly will be a huge reaction on the part of American women if Roe v. Wade is indeed overturned.
How about in the past? Did you see, after the backlash to women's progress, a struggle that was then born out of that?
Yes, and the most notable example, of course, is the birth of the second wave of the feminist movement, fighting against the feminine mystique that overtook America right after World War II. So, yeah, I think the backlash of the feminine mystique, sending Rosie the Riveter and her sisters back home, finally caused another backlash of the powerful second wave of the feminist movement.
In your survey of this long history, several hundred years, going back to the 17th century, is there a period of time that you could look at and say this might have been the biggest rupture that had occurred?
The biggest rupture in the sense
from the status quo, from how things were before?
No, I think there are a number of incidents that ruptured the status quo. One that I found so fascinating was perhaps one of the first social forces that ruptured the status quo. So United States was established as a country. And of course, men had to go about building the new country, and the job was left to the men or assigned to the men. Women were to make homes for the men while they troubled their head with building the new country. women were told that they did indeed have special roles, that is, that they had to, with their superior virtue, their morality, because they weren't driven by men's often uncontrollable appetites. They had to teach men how to be better. And what was meant by that, of course, is they had to imbue their sons with morality. I discovered that in a number of sources, beginning in the 1790s and certainly in the early 19th century newspaper accounts and ministers asking women to step up to their job, to take their role because of their superior moral virtue, the fact that they didn't have these drives that men had that often made them, quote, sinful. Women had a role in the new republic. But women took that seriously, and they decided that they would get rid of prostitution, for instance, and they began to form moral reform societies on a national level all over the country, beginning in the 1830s. And they did things that were unprecedented for the notion of woman. They stepped out of their home. They formed these organizations. In some cases, as a group, they invaded houses of prostitution to sing hymns to the sinful fornicators. They took on a role that women had never taken on before. They urged the legislatures all over the country to pass laws against men who seduced innocent women. They were successful in getting those laws passed almost everywhere in the United States, in a relatively new country. They also believed that they had superior virtue in terms of the demon drink. And so they formed temperance societies all over the country. Again, they organized as women never really had on a large scale before. Almost every state had a temperance society. They were often women-led temperance societies. They did very unwomanly things, like long before Carrie Nation in the early 20th century, in the 19th century, in the 1840s, they invaded saloons with hatchets, and they broke into these barrels of liquor. And I love one story that I tell where they invaded one saloon, and a woman said to a man who was drinking, "Get out of here." And he said, "Let me at least finish my drink. Will you do that?" And she said, "No, I would rather brain you with his hatchet and send you to heaven sober." Very unwomanly kind of speech. And so it was fascinating to me that what was supposedly men's urging women to be the epitome of woman, to help men become more moral, to help men control their appetites, was actually woman's entrance into the world. And eventually, they claimed that they were still doing housekeeping. They were doing housekeeping on a large scale. And eventually, this housekeeping on a large scale, municipal housekeeping, became some of the first of the paid professions for middle-class women. They became social workers. They took an active role in the late 19th and early 20th century in helping to form public policy. But I trace that back to what happened in the late 18th, early 19th century, with women being told that they had a superior morality that they had to imbue in the men of their family.
So you see a connection to that with the birth of a notion, a modern notion that we all now recognize today, but it's not some ancient notion, that of social work.
Yes. Yeah, I think that the first social workers were women who were doing housekeeping on a large scale. Indeed, Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House, who was a pioneer social worker in the late 19th and early 20th century said it as much. It was women's role to help the poor, to establish legislation for children. I would even go as far as to suggest that some of our best legislation came through that impulse, was established during the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. And some of the leaders in urging Roosevelt to establish that legislation were women who had been active in the early social work movement, such as Frances Perkins, the first woman to hold a cabinet position, the Secretary of Labor. She urged FDR towards Social Security, which was passed in 1935. Eleanor Roosevelt herself had been very active in some of these early women's betterment movements in the early 20th century. And I think through women that she worked with in the betterment movements, such as Molly Dewson, for instance, in groups such as the Women's Trade Union League, she was able to get FDR to think about these policies that became so much a part of the New Deal.
Frances Perkins, such a great example. Even before she joined FDR's cabinet as Secretary of Labor, first woman secretary in a cabinet, she was working in New York, and New York's government, New York City. She was working with immigrant workers. She was just outside where the triangle shirtwaist fire occurred.
Yes. And also working with settlement houses, and very much influenced by Jane Addams. So there's a real connection, I think, between FDR's wonderful policies and the New Deal and these early women reformers of the early decades of the 20th century.
It was interesting to hear about the entryways into women organizing, and you mentioned sort of anti-prostitution efforts. And of course, if we were to put that in today's context, it would be pretty controversial, as there are serious debates, including among women groups, about sex work.
Yes, and sex-positive women feminists. There was something that was called the sex wars in the 1980s with radical feminists who were very opposed to pornography, for instance, and wanted to pass legislation against pornography, and sex-positive feminists who fought them and were very much on the side of women sex workers, and worried even about banning pornography and what that meant for freedoms, women's freedoms as well as men's freedoms. So it's certainly been a very complex issue.
And one that has evolved back to the 19th century.
Yes. And of course, so much of the Me Too movement has to do with asserting women's rights to say no when they're displeased about men's harassment.
How do you see the Me Too movement in history? And has there been anything like that before?
I've been fascinated by the Me Too movement and the history of women's true accusations against their harassers. I talk about these medical doctors of the early 20th century who insisted that often women's so-called accusations came out of hysteria or changing their minds about what was first consensual, or simply disliking a man and wanting to get him in trouble. Medical doctors seldom would not believe women who accused men. The Me Too movement sort of reversed this. It was the first time that women as a group said, you have to listen to us. This has happened not just to me, but it's ubiquitous. And of course, the internet was a huge aid in spreading word of the movement and the proliferation of the movement. I love it that in 2017 we had the largest one-day demonstration ever against the harasser in chief, and women wore pussy hats to remind the harasser in chief that this would not go, that they were calling men, and particularly him, on their harassment of women.
Yeah, Trump was like the backlash, and then we got the backlash to him, kind of that dynamic we were talking about earlier.
Yes.
I remember being in Washington, D.C. on that day. I could hardly move. I remember being on the platform on a metro station. It was kind of scary because the platforms are really narrow, and there are people right at the edge of it. I mean, I used to live in Washington, D.C. I was a Capitol reporter. I went back to cover the beginning of the Trump administration, and like my second day there was that day of the protest, and I had never seen that many people in one place before.
Yeah. It was interesting to me that women who accused men of sexual harassment or sexual abuse, even into the 1990s, were so often not believed. And I'm thinking particularly of Anita Hill and her accusation of Clarence Thomas during the Senate Judiciary confirmation hearings, and how polls showed that most Americans simply did not believe Anita Hill. I think that would no longer be the case. I think that because of the Me Too movement, America realizes how ubiquitous sexual harassment is, and Anita Hill's story would have been considered much more plausible than it was in the 1990s. But one of the good parts, if something like that, what ultimately I think we have to see is a tragedy, certainly for women's rights, for Roe v. Wade, for instance. One of the good parts of that is it brought about the third wave of the women's movement, with women again waking up and saying women will never be equal if they are harassed in the workplace. And that really triggered the women's movement that seemed to be in hiatus in the 1980s. In the 1990s, it woke up yet again.
And it just feels like it's about to get some more fuel.
Yep. Yes, which is the upside, I suppose, of the terrible thing that may happen in the Supreme Court, that women will again wake up and realize that we can't let our guard down. We have to keep fighting for our rights, or they'll be revoked.
Lillian Faderman has been our guest. Lillian Faderman is a renowned scholar of lesbian history and literature. She's the author of a number of books. She has joined us for a conversation on her latest. It's called Woman, The American History of an Idea. Lillian Faderman, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
So have I, Mitch. Thank you for inviting me.